So I feel that this work of emotional healing and trauma healing and exploring that is very relevant in the Journey to Glow conversation, because after almost 3 years of interviewing like 70 plus skin healing, holistic skin healing experts, functional practitioners, naturopathic doctors, Chinese medicine, Ayurveda, holistic nutrition, like all of the more inside out approach, but more body focused. In the last season, I could feel in my consciousness over here, like tap, tap, tap. You need to look at something else now. You need to look at the emotional component. And I was like, nope, don't have time. I don't have time for this. So you get back to work and you ignore it. You keep pushing through. And it's been really nagging at me that it seems to be like the missing link, because I keep hearing from many people that they've tried, a lot of stuff, from supplements to diets and the problem with that is that, it can work and it's going to support you, and you need to have an anti-inflammatory diet, and, you need to look at GMOs in your food. And there's no doubt that that's really important. But what I've learned from working with this medicine woman, and I want to hear your thoughts on this, is that healing won't be long lasting or full and complete until you really integrate all aspects of yourself. And it might call to look at traumas. And I want to hear, because you have your background in this, and you segued your business to focus on trauma healing. And on your webinar last time, you said a few things that really clicked for me, and you explained the different kinds of traumas, because I had a misunderstanding about it. So I want to talk about all of this with you today, Kaity. So thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, I'm really excited to be here and to dive in, because I feel like this work, as you said, it's really, really important for full-bodied health. And it's also oftentimes what people are avoiding and trying to do the other quote unquote quick and easy fixes of oh, well, let me just take this herb, or let me just drink a lot of green juice. And then you're still in your patterns and you still have your blockages. And the green juice and the herbs are so helpful, but it's also sometimes you have to dig up the roots before you can plant new ways of being into yourself. So that's really, I feel like, the heart of a lot of the work that I do. And even you mentioned Ayurvedic medicine, which I have a little bit of a background in. And so much of Ayurvedic medicine is about that too, is about extractive work of well, let's not necessarily do we need to add anything to you, but what do we need to extract that's keeping you from actually being who you already are?
In balance and with radiant health. That had never occurred to me, that Ayurveda is more about extracting. Can you tell me more?
There's in some of the traditional texts, they talk about old ghosts or old entities. And a lot of traditional, back in the day, Ayurveda was about how do we actually get rid of these bhutas, these old ghosts that are really connected to the liver, actually. And as you know a lot about, the liver is so connected to your skin and your detox pathways and your full health, but it's an organ that's really, really connected to emotional holding as well. So actually, I find in a lot of my clients, there's a lot of liver stagnation and a lot of toxicity in the liver, not just from our modern diet, lifestyle, toxins, which is huge. That in itself is huge, but it's also in the toxic ways of being that we have in the modern world. But so in Ayurveda, these ghosts are considered like old unprocessed emotions, old unprocessed experiences and thoughts, other people's energies, ancestral baggage, like that whole package of things that like we carry that don't belong with us anymore.
So how did you, from your background in Ayurveda and teaching yoga, how did you decide to transition to what you're doing now? And tell us exactly what you're doing. What's the core of your work?
Yeah. Well, so I struggled with a lot of different things, starting at a young age, right? Whether that be more of like my physical health struggles from really intense allergies, skin issues, and digestive issues, like constantly getting strep throat over and over again. And also simultaneously, a lot of depression, anxiety, trauma in my lineage and in my childhood that I didn't even really realize was there until later on in my life. But now I see is just like so connected to everything else that I had going on. And I came to yoga when I was about 14 years old, and I started teaching when I was 19. And I had my first, what I'll call my first in my body experience, where I was like in a restorative yoga class and was like, oh my gosh, like, what is this feeling? And it was just me accessing my parasympathetic nervous system for like the first memorable time in my life, where I was like, it was a really wild experience because it was like, this is possible. Like, what is this place?
Mm.
And it felt really good. Obviously, it was like, and it also made me realize like, oh, there's something really here. Like, there's something that's really juicy here for me. So I just from that moment on got like sucked into the vortex of yoga and healing. And around that same time, maybe a couple years before I started my first teacher training, I was also working with some naturopaths, holistic doctors, doing all of the like herbal side of things, clearing out mold and parasites and all of this stuff. And you know, I was on birth control for a time period, and I came off it right after my yoga teacher training, because I was like having this awakening about like, oh, like what is it that I actually really want to like put into my body. And so I came off of my birth control, and that led to like this whole eruption of other symptoms that like in itself we could talk about for a really long time.
Mm.
But as I continued on this journey, which has always been really firmly rooted in like connecting to my body in different ways, whether that be through the foods I eat or how I move or touch, I've just continued to discover how much I've been holding and how much actual, I guess you could call it like lack of awareness or numbness I've had in different areas of my body. And as these body spaces started to wake up, then I was like, oh, wow, there's a lot of trauma here actually that you're not aware of it until you're aware of it. And I also think because of my family background, my lineage, my ancestors, there's been such a high amount of sexual trauma and emotional trauma and physical trauma in my lineage that I know that I have been carrying with me since I was born, probably maybe even before then. I feel like sometimes I'm just like, I can be like the ancestral sponge, or some beings are born into the family system to really start doing some of that like deep excavating work that definitely feels really resonant for me. And so I had an experience about 2 years ago where it wasn't my first time experiencing sexual trauma, but it was my first time knowing I was experiencing sexual trauma. And it made it like that much more intense to be conscious of it.
Mm.
And it made it like unavoidable. Like I have to work on this. I have to heal this. I have to dig into this. And so I've, ever since that experience, have been spending like so much of my time and energy personally and professionally working really, really deeply in trauma healing. And the cool thing is that, you know, this experience, while I'm like horrified that it happened, would never ask for that, would never want to experience that, or for anyone else to, had it was like a wake up moment for me too, like, because it shone a light on all of the other experiences I've had sexually and interpersonally in my entire life where I felt like my boundaries have been violated, which you were at the webinar a couple of weeks ago, and that is a form of trauma, is when there's a boundary violation. So that's a little bit about like what has led me here. It's been a really deep journey, and it's been a lot of shadow work. It's been a lot of shadow work and, like I said, excavating work. And I've actually like, I was at an event with a new colleague a couple of weeks ago and was sharing with him a little bit about the work I do, and said, yeah, I work with trauma survivors and women who've survived sexual trauma. He's like, oh my gosh, that sounds so intense. Like, how do you do that? That just sounds like the like darkest, heaviest thing. And it kind of like took me aback for a minute, because it's like, oh, I think maybe because I've been in it, I'm not afraid of it anymore, or it doesn't have the same charge of intensity. I'm like, this is actually it's really powerful.
You know, I remember when I first came across this kind of work, and I didn't connect to the word trauma, and then you started to explain it, and I was like, oh, it's not at all what I thought. So give us the examples of traumas that you taught in your past webinar, and you had this graphic that was phenomenal.
It's interesting because when I say the word trauma, you're going to have some sort of idea of what that means, or like some sort of feeling about it. And for most people, that means like, you think about a veteran or someone who's experienced like an explicit rape, or like wars, physical violence, those sort of things all fall into the category of trauma and are explicitly like traumatic, right? And really associated with PTSD. But what the interesting thing is about trauma is that it doesn't really have so much to do with, doesn't really have to do with the event. It has to do with how your nervous system perceives the event, how it perceives what's happening around you. So in that sense, the definition of trauma is actually really, really fluid, and it looks different for each of us. Like, you and I could experience the exact same event, and I might walk away fine, and you might walk away with a trauma around it. And it's just fascinating to me, because it's how your unique nervous system has processed. So a couple of the definitions that I like to use around what trauma is, we talked earlier about like a breach of boundary, right? So you have something like your boundary of space, and someone breaches that. That happens in small ways to us, like every day. And for some people, it's more traumatic than others. But not having your no listened to, not being respected in what you want and what you need, can be traumatic for the system. There's, you know, a physical explicit trauma, like getting into a car crash or an injury. And then there's developmental trauma. And that is, you know, if we think of the typical definition of trauma as too much, too fast, too soon, like anything that was just like, this is overwhelming and too much to process right now. Developmental trauma happens during the formative years, and it's more like not enough, too slow. And so that's things like abandonment or neglect, or feeling lonely or alone when you're a baby, which in itself is like terrifying for a baby. Yeah. There's ancestral trauma that we come into this world with from our lineage. And there is also this concept around trauma, which I've learned from my studies in shamanism, that has to do with soul loss. And that's really where like the heart of my work comes in, because I think that's where most of the juice is for me, is around that. Because when we do soul retrieval, then just everything else can kind of naturally line back up, because there's nothing more powerful than the energy of your own soul re-entering your body. And if you haven't experienced that, for those of you listening, it's like that is medicine. That is like the heart of what medicine means and what it is. And so trauma, the way that I really like to look at it is, a trauma is in any experience that your soul essence departs. It's any experience where you're not actually able to be present, like in the present moment, with like your full bodied awareness, with your full soul and self online. All of those mini moments we check out, we numb, we avoid being present, actually can really, really be connected in its root to a traumatic experience. And once we start to heal that, what I found in myself and in the people I work with over and over and over again is actually so much more presence and pleasure and aliveness than really we've ever thought was possible for ourselves.
My understanding was that our soul is always there. Are you talking about soul fragments, or because my understanding is that if the soul's not there, and I'm not sure what the line is between soul and consciousness, but then I'm not alive, or I'm dead, I'm lifeless. And as I say this, it reminds me of all of us that's too much on our phones, and that we're like zombies, and just not present to life, not smelling the flowers, not slowing down. We're just operating from,
Mm-hmm.
uh,
Yeah, that's the interesting thing, is that most of us, or many of us, are operating from that place of lifeless and don't even really realize it.
yeah.
But I think, what comes to my mind with what you're speaking to is just like what we were talking about earlier on, which is, yeah, the soul is always there. It's not really going anywhere. Sometimes the soul isn't quite set in the body though. Like there's that piece of embodiment.
Mhm.
I'll talk more about that in a moment. But really, like the most powerful part of what we call soul retrieval work, it's not really necessarily that you're going out somewhere and retrieving your soul, right? It's like looking for your soul searching. No, like your soul is there, but what we're doing is removing the contractive blockages, aka traumas, anything that's contracting, blocking, distorting, creating a misperception, a mis way of seeing who you actually are, trauma.
Mhm.
Um, we're actually beginning to not necessarily like remove those blockages from a place of like, oh, these suck, these need to go away, these are bad, inherently bad things, but seeing these blockages actually as protective mechanisms that have tried to keep you safe. Because it's terrifying, for especially for many women, is to be fully in their bodies and alive, because for so many years that's made us a target. I mean, think about like the witch burnings, right? When we tap into our intuition and our embodied power, we can become targets, right? So there's something that has happened for a lot of women, a lot of men too, a lot of just humans in general, where we've built up these walls and blockages from our soul power, so that we can stay safe and we can stay like in the normal way of everyday being and operate in our twisted modern day society in a safer way, right?
Yeah.
So, and that happens in micro ways too, right? If, for example, I'll speak to my own trauma. When I experienced my sexual trauma, it was actually during a time of my life when I was feeling the most myself, like completely open, radiant, grounded, alive, like creative, just so good. And then I was raped. And in my nervous system, it equated, okay, whenever you're open, something's going to come and harm you. Whenever you're in this creative space, you're going to be a victim or like automatically be the prey to the predator dynamic, right? And that's not actually true. And I've done a lot of work actually since then on more of my own like self-protection and bringing up more self-protection when I'm in a space of expansion, because that's super necessary. But so we have these little ways that our system equates our soulful self with actually like danger and threat. And so normally, what people most want is to feel happy and alive. And that's also usually what we're most afraid of.
I'm thinking about even in smaller ways when maybe you're a child, you're younger, and you're just embodying your childlike personality, and then your parents tell you to quiet down, or you're too much, or the saying, oh, she's so full of herself, because she's just embodying her full self, and it's triggering other people that have issues, their own issues, and they're not confident, and it brings things up to the surface. When you see people working with trauma, I mean, there's so many ways. I don't think interpretation is part of it, but I'm just curious because you talked about being like your full embodied self and radiant and so creative and so alive, and in comes, I would say in my language, a dark force attracted to your light. Is that an energetic attraction, or is it just coincidence? Or is it synchronicity for you to heal something? And how did you make it up? And is it important to make up that story or to break it down, or is it not part of the work at all?
Mm-hmm. So like, here's the thing, because it's really, really complex, especially like around sexual trauma. It's like just super complex, because here's like an excruciating event that's so connected to one of your greatest pleasures as a human, right? And with most all traumas, there is this quality of shame and victim blaming or self-blaming that happens. This was my fault. What did I do wrong? What could I have done differently? And when we're in that space of self-blame, no healing can really happen. So oftentimes, like, especially if there's been like an explicit event that has happened, but even like with the micro traumas, the first step is self-compassion and realizing like, this isn't your fault, whether it's karma, whether it's like it happens for a reason, whatever you want to believe about it, like that, all of those things might be true. And it's not your fault that this happened. Like,
Yeah.
It's really not. And that can take people years to get to that space of it's not my fault. Years of like consistent effort and healing, because it's so twisted and there's so many different layers of it. But that's really what I would call like the first step, is just self-compassion. And part of that also, like, for me and for many people, comes hand in hand with actually blaming other people, like being able to blame someone else. And in the spiritual world, that in itself might make some of you gasp, like, oh, you're gonna blame someone else for like what your experience is. But yeah, it's like, that's actually a really important part of the healing process, is realizing, A, this wasn't all my fault, and B, there are forces outside of me that perhaps are to blame here. Yeah. And then you can move into more of the like soul retrieval and empowerment work, and perhaps even forgiveness work, if that's something that you want to do. But actually, before you can transcend your quote unquote victimhood, you have to embody it and enter it and accept it and love it. And so that's really the first step. And I find when I'm working with someone who's just recently experienced the trauma or hasn't done really any work around it at all, it's a lot around that, like, realization of, oh, this wasn't my fault. This isn't my fault. And once that happens, then things kind of begin to move a little bit more quickly. That process takes a long time for some people. And then from there, and really during the whole healing process, we just continue to turn to the body and notice what's present in the body and what stifled responses need to keep moving through, and where there's opportunity for that soul retrieval work for the soul to move back in.
Yes, and I'm just going to drop this here, but you have a webinar coming up on May 22nd, which is a Saturday.
Yeah.
And if anybody listening is curious, I'm going to put a link so that they can sign up, so that they can see what that actually looks like. Because you're going to do a somatic healing live with someone on the call.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's a little hard to do this on a podcast, although I think this video might be available too. But people can always go and join your webinar so that they can see what that looks like into practice and experience that for themselves. And it's very rich work. And you shared your journey, which is sexual trauma. But I really want people listening to hear that. And that was an insight for me, was that I never considered that I had big traumas compared to, what's happening in the world. But then, as a young 8-year-old who fell off her horse and cut her finger and was in a lot of pain, and my destiny changed that day from being an equestrian doing competition to being taken away my horse and not being allowed to be with horses anymore. Like, that changed my life. It changed my destiny. And that was a trauma. And I was like, oh, well, look at that. I do have some traumas. And to link it back to, because, our focus on Journey to Glow is healing skin, which is really not healing skin. It's really healing, just different parts of ourselves that connects to that manifestation that looks like rosacea or acne. Or I just felt that it could be like a really interesting doorway for people to explore, whether they want to connect with you through your Instagram or your webinar, your new program coming up, your beautiful new website. And again, it's not, I was hesitant in bringing this on the podcast. And at the same time, I was like, listen, here's something that people might feel called to explore. It might not be for everyone. Like I said, like for me, 3 years of creating Journey to Glow, and this was always calling to my consciousness, but it took me 3 years to be ready. And so at least dropping this here on the podcast might open doors. Some people might jump in right away and want to work with you to be guided one-on-one, which I know you do. We have such an opportunity now to look at what it really means to heal and what it really means to be fully embodied and to be in our own sovereign power, and to take the healing process back into our own hands and to question what has been pushed on us for so long, from what I call the medical mafia to big pharma to the destruction of our lands because of monocropping and glyphosate, which becomes the food we eat and poisons us, and cancer, which didn't come from thin air. It's not genetics. It had to come from somewhere. That piece of looking at trauma healing, emotional healing, whatever people want to call it, I think that's the last part of the medicine we need to bring in, that I feel we haven't brought in so far in Journey to Glow. We explored, everything else. I don't think I can do much more podcast episodes at this point on those topics. We've covered it. But that missing link, which, asks us to create a compassionate space and a safe space for us to look at that. Just in wrapping up our interview, how would you say that people can prepare for that work?
For the somatic work?
Mm-hmm.
Well, It's a great question. And I think it starts with actually, and this is something we'll talk about in the webinar too, but actually beginning to trust in feeling your body more. Mm. And, so many humans are really stuck in the seductive pull of the mind or of the emotions. And both of those are really important spaces and have a lot of power, but it's actually the body that knows exactly what needs to happen for healing and for integration. It's the body that is the vessel for any of this deep work to happen. And just taking a moment and tuning into like what sensations are present in my body, and can I actually welcome them and invite them in rather than resist them so much. Like I've been working with, I have from some early childhood trauma, I've been working with this feeling of like a black ball in my solar plexus that feels really correlated to just some shaming that happened when I was little. And I've been working with just letting myself feel it and letting it, like, because emotion is energy in motion, right? And the energy part of it is the sensation. And then we get stuck in the emotion when we don't let the sensation move. So the sensation moves by us being with it and letting it move. So when we're with our sensations, things start to really move. The energetics of the body start to move, and from there, physical things can change. I've been working with a woman who she's had her period since like August, like just been bleeding daily, right? And we started working together a couple of months ago. And after our first session, she stopped bleeding for 2 weeks. And then she started again. And then we just saw each other again last week and she stopped bleeding. So it's really interesting when we start to do this sensation work. And she, by the way, doesn't have any explicit traumas that we're working on. Like she just wanted some more support with the physical stuff going on in her body through this energetic and an emotional realm of work that I do. And it's just fascinating how much actually can shift and change. And especially working with the skin, which I know many of the people listening to this are working with skin issues. That is all about boundaries. That is all about repressed anger. That is all about all of the emotions in the liver, right? So when we start to actually work with letting those release through sensation, sometimes people after a session might break out in a rash, like an emotional rash, and then it goes away. But it's definitely has the possibility to help on all layers of our physical healing, emotional healing, spiritual healing, just by being with and allowing sensations in your body to move.
Yeah. Your webinar is called Activating the Embodied Intuition.
Yeah.
On May 22nd, I'm going to link that. And your website is hertemplehealing.com.
Yes.
And on Instagram, you are also Her Temple Healing.
Mm-hmm. And there's a period between each word.
Okay. Thank you so much. I feel that we just touched the surface, that there's so much more to explore. Maybe it's going to open the possibility of doing a specific workshop for Journey to Glow. If anybody is interested in getting in touch, everything is going to be linked in the show notes. And thank you so much, Kaity, for sharing your passion and your wisdom. Thank you.
Thank you.